The fog came in low that morning, the way it often did along the Solent, drifting off the grey water in long, unhurried ribbons that caught against the hulls of anchored ships and clung there reluctant to leave. It moved through the rigging of vessels already old, with salt and use, curling around lines and spars, softening every edge until the harbour at Portsmouth seemed to exist only in suggestion. A shape here, a shadow there, the outline of something vast, resolving itself slowly out of white. It was the 19th of July, in the year 1545, though no one standing on the wet stones of the dockside that morning would have needed to be told the date. They carried it in their bodies, in the particular tension of a summer spent watching the horizon. England was a kingdom braced. Word had come days before that a French fleet, larger than any seen in living memory, some said upward of 200 vessels, had gathered across the Channel with clear and simple intention. Invasion. The French king had grown weary of skirmishes and border disputes, weary of an English monarch who seemed to believe himself untouchable behind his moat of grey water, and now he meant to prove otherwise. The fleet had been sighted off the Isle of Wight only the day before. Portsmouth that morning was a harbour holding its breath, but the fog did not know this or did not care. It moved the same way it always had, indifferent to armies and ambitions, settling over the masts of the English fleet as it had settled over fishing boats and merchant cogs for centuries before any king had thought to build a navy at all. And out of that fog slowly, the way a memory surfaces before the mind has fully placed it, there emerged the masts of a ship larger than any other in the harbour, 4 of them, rising through the mist like the bones of something ancient, hung with rigging that dripped with the night's damp and the morning's gathering warmth. She was called the Mary Rose, and she had been afloat by that July morning for 34 years, a span of time that made her something of a grandmother among warships, a vessel that had seen kings crowned and wars fought, and treaties signed and broken again, and had outlasted most of the timber and canvas that had first gone to sea beside her. Her hull, when the fog thinned enough to reveal it, sat heavy and broad in the water, high-castled at bow and stern in the old fashion. Her sides pierced with the dark mouths of gun ports that had been added and altered and reinforced across the decades of her service, as if the ship herself had grown a new kind of armour to match a new kind of war. She did not look elegant. She looked, instead, like something built for permanence, for weight, for the long, slow business of holding a line at sea and outlasting whatever came against her. The harbour around her was full of sound, even through the fog, even at that early hour, perhaps especially at that early hour, when the work of readying a fleet for battle did not pause for weather or for the hour of the sun's rising. There was the creak of timber shifting against timber, the low groan of hulls settling into their moorings as the tide worked beneath them, a sound so constant to those who lived by the water that they had long since stopped hearing it as sound at all, the way a person stops hearing their own heartbeat. There were gulls, too, always gulls in a harbour, wheeling and calling above the masts, indifferent to the great matters of state playing out beneath them, more interested in the scraps thrown from galley windows and the fish stirred up by the movement of so many hulls in close water. Their cries carried oddly in the fog, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, disembodied voices in the white. And beneath all of it, threading through every plank and rope and sail, there was the smell. Tar, thick and dark, boiled and worked into the seams of every hull in the harbour to keep the sea where it belonged. Outside the wood, salt, always salt. In the air and on the tongue and in the fine white crust that formed on rope and rail after a night at anchor. And beneath that, the human smell of the fleet itself, of tallow and sweat, and the smoke of galley fires being coaxed to life below decks, of gunpowder stored dry in magazines that no sailor liked to think about too long, of the particular mustiness of canvas sail, folded and stowed and unfolded again 100 times across a ship's long working life. It was the smell of a world entirely enclosed, a floating village of oak and rope that had its own weather inside its own walls, regardless of what the sky above chose to do. Aboard the Mary Rose herself, in those grey hours the ship was coming awake, in the particular way that a warship comes awake before battle. Not with haste, not yet, but with the low, steady hum of several hundred men going about tasks they had rehearsed so many times. Somewhere around 400 souls would crowd her decks and holds that day, sailors and soldiers and gunners and officers, more than had ever sailed her in the years of her long peacetime service, packed now into every space that could hold a body, because the king had ordered his fleet to war footing, and the Mary Rose, old as she was, remained one of the pride vessels of his navy. Lines were being checked, guns were being seen to, their carriages tested, their ports greased against the salt air. Somewhere below in the galley, a fire had been lit, despite the danger of it, because men could not fight on empty stomachs, and the smell of that fire, of bread perhaps, or the last of some salted meat, mingled now with the tar and the salt and the gunpowder into something that was entirely and only the smell of a ship preparing herself. From the dock, or from one of the smaller boats moving between the anchored fleet with messages and supplies, a person looking up at her that morning might have felt what people so often feel in the presence of something built to outlast them, a kind of quiet awe mixed with something less easily named. She was ancient by the standards of ships. She had been built in the first years of the young king's reign, when he was not yet the heavy, storied monarch of later portraits, but a young man newly crowned, eager to build a navy that could stand against the great sea powers of Europe. She had carried that ambition on her hull for over 3 decades now, refitted and reinforced, made heavier with each passing year as new guns were added, and new fashions in naval warfare demanded new answers from old ships. She had seen the king young. She would that morning see him again, for it was said, though not yet confirmed by every witness, that King Henry himself had travelled to Portsmouth to watch his fleet meet the French, and that he might even now be somewhere along the shore or aboard one of the vessels nearby. Watching the fog lift from his ships with the particular pride of a man watching something he had built with his own will finally do the work it was built for. There is a stillness that settles over places just before something is lost to them. Not a supernatural stillness, nothing that could be measured or proven, but a quality of ordinary time that, looking back, seems to have been waiting. The gulls still called, the fog still drifted, the tide still moved beneath the hulls with its patient, indifferent rhythm, exactly as it had the day before and would the day after. Nothing marked that morning as different from 100 mornings before it. When the Mary Rose had ridden at anchor in this same harbour, her decks full of the same sounds, her hull holding the same weight of oak and rope and men. And yet it was different, though no one standing there could have said how or why or what exactly it was that made the fog seem, in memory, to hang a little longer over her masts than over any other ship in the fleet. The narrator of this story knows what the sailors on her deck that morning did not, knows how the day will end, knows what the tide will carry and what it will keep, knows already the shape of the grief that is coming for a king who has not yet lost anything. But that knowledge will wait. For now, in this grey hour, before the fog has fully lifted, before the French fleet has drawn close enough to force the English into open water, before the guns have been run out and the orders given, and the terrible small chain of decisions made that history will spend centuries trying to untangle, for now there is only the ship resting at anchor, her masts rising slowly out of the mist, her hull dark and vast and strangely peaceful in the water, 34 years old and carrying, without knowing it, only a handful of hours left to her. If you find comfort in these long, quiet histories, in ships and voyages, and the slow unfolding of things the sea has kept for centuries, you are welcome to stay a while longer here, and perhaps to subscribe, so that more of these lost voyages might find you when you need them, on some other quiet night like this one. The fog held. Somewhere beyond it, unseen still, the French fleet moved closer, through waters that would soon fill with more ships than Portsmouth had ever gathered to meet them. And the King's Navy readied itself in the mist, and the Mary Rose rode at her anchor, patient, ancient, unknowing. While the gulls called overhead, and the tar smell rose from her seams, and the tide beneath her turned, as it always did, toward whatever the day had already decided to bring. To understand what rode at anchor that morning in 1545, one had to go back 35 years, to a different England entirely, to a young king barely 2 years into his reign, restless with ambition, and hungry for the kind of glory that only a navy could provide. In the spring of 1510, Henry VIII was not yet the swollen, suspicious figure of later portraits, the man whose marriages would rewrite the religious map of a nation. He was 18 years old, athletic, vain in the manner of the genuinely gifted, and possessed of an instinct that would define much of his reign, the belief that England's future lay not merely on its own soil, but upon the water that surrounded it. His father, the first Henry of that dynasty, had left him a modest fleet and a treasury carefully hoarded through decades of caution. The son had no interest in caution. Within months of taking the throne, he had ordered the construction of 2 new warships, vessels built not as afterthoughts to trade or transport, but as instruments of state power in their own right, conceived from their very first timber to be weapons. One of these was named for his sister Mary, and perhaps for the Virgin as well, in the manner of the age when piety and politics wore the same coat. She was called the Mary Rose, and she would become in time the most famous ship that England had yet built, though no one cutting her keel in that Portsmouth yard could have known it. The forests that gave her shape were not chosen carelessly. English oak, prized across Europe for its density and its slow, patient strength, came from the Weald of Kent and Sussex, from woodlands that had stood for generations before any shipwright laid eyes on them. The felling of trees for a warship of the Mary Rose's size was itself a small campaign, requiring hundreds of mature oaks, each one selected for the particular curve or straightness demanded by a specific part of the hull. Shipwrights of the period worked less like carpenters and more like sculptors reading the grain of living wood, searching the forest for trees whose natural bends matched the compass timbers needed for a ship's ribs, so that the strength of growth itself became the strength of the vessel. It has been estimated that the construction of a ship her size consumed the timber of many acres of mature woodland, an entire landscape quietly reshaped into a floating fortress. The felling would have begun in winter when sap ran low and the wood held its integrity best, and continued through the following seasons as trunks were hauled by ox and cart to the rivers, floated downstream, and delivered to the yards where the real work of building began. Portsmouth itself in 1510 was still a modest town, its dockyard young by the standards of later centuries but already understood by the Crown as a strategic asset, a natural harbour sheltered from the worst of the Channel's weather, positioned to watch the waters between England and France. The old enemy, whose shores lay close enough to be seen on a clear day from certain high points along the coast. It was here, in yards loud with the ring of adzes and the creak of block and tackle, that the keel of the Mary Rose was laid, a spine of English oak from which the rest of her would grow, rib by rib, plank by plank, over the months that followed. The shipwrights who built her were craftsmen whose skills had been passed down through generations, men who worked without the benefit of formal blueprints in the modern sense, relying instead on inherited proportion, on rules of thumb refined by decades of trial, on an intuitive geometry that lived in the hands rather than on paper. They built by eye and by feel as much as by measurement, shaping each futtock and knee to fit its neighbor, fastening the great oak planks to the frame with wooden trenails and iron bolts, caulking the seams with oakum and pitch until the hull could hold back the sea. It was slow work, demanding and unglamorous, performed in all weather by men whose names have mostly been lost to time, though their labor would outlast them by more than 4 centuries. What emerged from that Portsmouth yard was something genuinely new in English shipbuilding, though it did not look new to eyes accustomed to earlier vessels. The Mary Rose carried within her design the visible ancestry of the medieval castle ship, with raised structures at bow and stern that echoed the fortified towers of an older era, when naval combat had still resembled a floating extension of siege warfare. Ships grappling together so that soldiers might board and fight hand to hand as though the deck were simply another battlefield. But she was not merely that old idea reproduced. She represented a genuine hybrid, a vessel caught at the hinge point between 2 ages of naval warfare, and it was this hybrid nature that made her historically significant, whatever her ultimate fate would be. It was among the first English ships built from her very foundation to carry heavy cannon fired through gun ports set low in her hull, near the waterline, rather than relying solely on smaller guns mounted high on castle-like structures where they could do little more than clear an enemy's deck of men before boarding. This innovation, the true broadside gun port, with its hinged cover that could be sealed against the sea in rough weather, was still relatively novel in the England of 1510, and the Mary Rose was among the vessels that helped establish it as standard practice. Multiple gun decks ran the length of her hull, each one lined with cannon of varying size and purpose, from great bronze pieces capable of shattering another ship's timbers at range to smaller iron guns meant for closer, more personal violence. She carried, by the standards of her day, an extraordinary weight of ordnance, a floating battery that transforms naval warfare from a contest of boarding and melee into something closer to what later centuries would recognize as ship-to-ship gunnery. This was not a small thing. It was, in its quiet way, a revolution carried on the water, and the Mary Rose was among its earliest and most visible expressions. She was not the only such ship, nor even necessarily the most advanced of her generation, but she was prominent, she was proud, and she belonged to a king who understood the theater of power as well as its substance. To build a ship like the Mary Rose was to make a statement to every court in Europe that watched such things closely, that England intended to matter upon the sea in a way it had not fully mattered before, that the old kingdom on the edge of the continent was arming itself not merely for defense but for presence, for the kind of maritime assertion that France and Spain and the trading powers of the Italian city-states had long taken for granted as their own domain. The Mary Rose, then, was never simply a ship. She was an argument made in oak and iron, a floating claim upon the attention of Europe, launched at a moment when the young Henry was eager to prove that his reign would be one of consequence. And he was, by every surviving account, genuinely attached to her in a manner that went beyond the calculated interest of a monarch reviewing his assets. Henry visited his ships personally, an unusual habit for a king of that era, and the Mary Rose in particular seems to have held a place in his affection that outlasted the passing enthusiasms of youth. He is recorded as having taken pleasure in her guns, especially in the raw physical fact of her firepower, standing on her decks or nearby to watch demonstrations of her cannon, delighting in the thunder and smoke of a display that few other monarchs of the age could boast in quite the same measure. There is something almost boyish in the surviving impressions of Henry's relationship with his new navy, a genuine excitement in the mechanics of gunnery and shipbuilding that sat alongside his more calculated political interests. And the Mary Rose, as one of the first and finest expressions of that interest, seems to have earned. She was, in the language sometimes used by those who study this period, something like a favorite child among his early fleet, a vessel he returned to inspect, to admire, to show off before visiting dignitaries who might otherwise underestimate what England had begun to build for itself. This affection existed within a broader context that made such a ship not merely desirable, but necessary. The early 16th century was a period of shifting and often fragile alliances among the major powers of Western Europe and France. England's oldest rival remained the most persistent source of tension across the Channel. The two nations moved in and out of open hostility throughout Henry's reign, their disputes rooted in old claims to territory, in the endless jockeying for advantage that characterized Renaissance diplomacy, in matters of religion that would grow only more consequential as the decades passed. Naval strength had become, by this period, an unavoidable component of that rivalry, an arms race conducted not merely in the number of ships each crown could field, but in the sophistication of their design, the weight of their guns, the skill of the men who sailed them. To possess a ship like the Mary Rose was to hold a card in a game that both England and France understood perfectly well, and Henry, young and ambitious, was eager to play it. It would be a mistake, though, look back on the Mary Rose only through the lens of what would eventually happen to her, to see in her construction some early shadow of catastrophe waiting patiently across 3.5 decades. End quote. That is not how she was regarded by those who built her, sailed her, or stood upon her decks in the years of her prime. She was not doomed. She was beloved. She was the pride of a young king's navy, a vessel that carried within her hull both the old world of chivalric sea combat and the new world of gunnery and broadside power, and for over 3 decades she would serve faithfully, honorably, and without catastrophe, a workhorse of the Tudor navy that saw campaigns and repairs and refits. That grew older as her king grew older, that remained through all of it exactly what she had been built to be, a floating expression of English ambition, patient at her moorings, waiting only for the calling of duty, unaware, as ships and men so often are, of the particular morning that history had already set aside for her. 34 years afloat. The years that followed her launching were not years of idleness. A warship built at such expense, bearing such royal favor, was not meant to sit at anchor gathering barnacles while her purpose waited elsewhere. Within 2 years of her construction, the Mary Rose had already tasted the waters of conflict, sailing in the campaigns that marked the opening decades of the 16th century, when England's relationship with France remained what it had been for generations, an uneasy peace punctuated by outbursts of open hostility, alliances shifting like weather, and the perpetual undercurrent of dynastic ambition that ran beneath every treaty, signed and broken. In 1512, barely a year after she first touched saltwater, the Mary Rose sailed as part of an English fleet dispatched to Brittany, where she saw her first true action against French vessels in the waters near Brest. The engagement was not the stuff of legend. No chronicler would later write it into ballads sung in taverns. But it was there, in those early waters, that the ship proved herself capable of what she had been designed to do. She held her position in the line, she withstood the return fire of enemy guns, and she came home with her crew largely intact, which in the calculus of naval warfare in that era counted as no small success. The following year brought her into service again, this time in support of English operations along the French coast, where the persistent friction between Henry's ambitions and the French crown's resistance to them continued to demand a naval presence. She was present, though not always at the center of the action, during the years when England attempted with mixed success to press claims and alliances across the Channel. Her role in these years was less that of a decisive weapon and more that of a reliable instrument, one ship among a fleet, contributing her guns and her men to campaigns whose grander strategic outcomes rarely hinged on any single vessel's performance. It was not only against France that the Mary Rose saw service. In 1522 and again in the years that followed, tensions with Scotland drew English naval attention northward, and the ship's records, fragmentary as they are, pieced together from Admiralty accounts, victualling records, and the occasional surviving letter, suggest she patrolled those colder waters as well. Part of the effort to project English naval power along all the contested edges of the kingdom. The specifics of these northern deployments are less documented than her French engagements, the paper trail thinner, the certainty more provisional, but what remains suggests a ship in near constant use moved from theatre to theatre as the Crown's strategic priorities shifted. This was in truth the ordinary life of a Tudor warship, not a single dramatic battle that defined her, but a long accumulation of smaller deployments, each one unremarkable in isolation, each one adding to a cumulative record of service that, taken as a whole, built the ship's reputation among those who sailed her and those who commanded the fleet from London. She became known in naval circles as steady, dependable. A vessel that could be counted on to hold her station, to fire her guns true, to bring her crew home more often than not. This was not glamour. But in the world of maritime warfare, where the sea itself claimed as many ships as any enemy fleet, dependability was its own kind of glory. As the years passed, the Mary Rose did not remain unchanged. No ship of her era did. The vessel that had slipped down the slipway at Portsmouth in 1511 was, by the 1532nd, in many ways a different creature altogether, though she bore the same name and occupied, nominally, the same hull. Naval architecture in this period was evolving with a speed that outpaced almost any other technology of the age, driven by the rapid advancement of gun founding, the increasing sophistication of naval tactics, and the simple, relentless pressure of competition between the naval powers of Europe, each trying to outbuild and outgun the other. The most significant of these changes came in the major refit of 1536, a project undertaken at royal expense and with considerable attention from the king himself, who by this time had watched his favoured ship serve for a quarter century and saw in her continued relevance. The refit added substantial weight to the vessel. New decks were built above the original structure, raising her silhouette and adding to her carrying capacity for both men and guns. Her displacement, by the estimates that later historians and marine archaeologists would piece together from the wreck itself, increased by several hundred tons from her original construction. This was not a small alteration. It was, in effect, a fundamental transformation of the ship's proportions, her center of gravity, her relationship to the water that bore her. Additional gun ports were cut into her hull during this period, part of the broader shift in naval thinking that had occurred during her decades of service. A shift away from the older model of ships, as floating platforms for boarding actions. Vessels whose primary purpose was to deliver broadside fire with increasing volume and increasing range. The Mary Rose, built at the hinge point of this transition, was modified again and again to keep pace with it, each refit adding guns, adding weight, adding complexity to a hull that had been designed, originally, for a somewhat different kind of war. It is worth pausing here in this account of her middle years to consider what these changes meant for the ship herself, not in any sense of consciousness or intention, for a ship possesses neither, but in the more literal sense of physics and construction, of how a vessel built for one purpose gradually accumulates the adaptations of another. Each addition of weight above her original waterline altered, incrementally, her stability. Each new gunport cut into her hull reduced, incrementally, the margin of safety her design had originally provided. These were not reckless alterations. The shipwrights and naval architects who oversaw them were skilled men, working within the best understanding of their craft that the age provided. But they were alterations nonetheless, small compromises accumulated over decades, each one reasonable in isolation. Each one adding its portion to a slowly shifting equation of risk that no single observer at any single point in the process could have fully perceived. This is often how catastrophe accumulates, not through a single reckless decision, but through a long series of adjustments, each sensible on its own terms, each responding rationally to the pressures of its moment, until the sum of them creates a vulnerability that no one intended and no one, perhaps, could have fully seen. The Mary Rose was not a poorly built ship. She was, by the standards of her age, an exceptionally well-built one. But she was also, by 1545, a ship carrying a different burden than the one for which she had originally been designed. Her proportions altered by 3 decades of modification in service of an evolving military doctrine that demanded more guns, more men, more weight, more capability from a hull that had a finite capacity to absorb such demands. The men who served aboard her across these years deserve their own accounting, though the historical record, as is so often the case with common sailors and soldiers of the period, preserves their names far less completely than it preserves the names of kings and admirals. Some names do survive. Vice Admiral George Carew, who would command her in her final engagement, had a naval career stretching back years before that fatal July morning. A man from a family with deep connections to the Tudor court and considerable experience in the maritime affairs of the crown. Before him, other commanders had walked her decks, men whose names appear in muster rolls and pay records. Fragments of identity preserved in the bureaucratic residue of Tudor administration, though the fuller texture of their lives, their characters, their particular relationships with the ship they commanded, has mostly been lost to time. The gunners who served aboard her across these decades were, in many cases, professionals of a specialized trade, men who understood the particular science of Tudor gunnery, the mixing of powder, the loading and firing of the heavy bronze and iron guns that had become the ship's primary weapon of war. Some of these gunners were English by birth, trained in the naval yards and arsenals of the kingdom. Others, as naval records from the period suggest, were foreign specialists, drawn from the Low Countries or from Italian city-states, where the science of artillery had developed with particular sophistication. Brought into English service for their expertise in an age when good gunners were valuable enough to justify the expense and complication of foreign recruitment. The ordinary sailors, the men who climbed her rigging, who worked her pumps, who slept in her cramped lower decks, remain almost entirely anonymous to history, known only through the collective evidence of muster rolls listing numbers rather than names, and later, more hauntingly, through the physical evidence that archaeologists would eventually recover from her hull, the skeletal remains of men who died aboard her, whose bones would tell stories their names could not, revealing ages, injuries, occupations, and origins through the patient work of forensic analysis centuries after their deaths. By the early 1542, the Mary Rose had become, in the eyes of the English naval establishment, precisely what King Henry had hoped she would be when he first commissioned her construction. A proven vessel, tested by decades of service, modified to keep pace with evolving naval technology, trusted by commanders and feared, presumably, by enemies who had encountered her guns across those various campaigns in French and Scottish waters. She was not new, she was not untested. She was, by any reasonable measure, available to the men who sailed and commanded her. A known quantity, an aging but capable warship, 34 years into a life of service, carrying the accumulated weight of every refit and modification that had kept her relevant across more than 3 decades of changing naval doctrine. There was no reason, in the spring of 1545, for anyone in Portsmouth or London to view the Mary Rose with anything but confidence. She had survived storms. She had survived battles, however minor. She had survived the ordinary wear of long service and the extraordinary transformation of major refit. She had outlasted other ships built in the same years, other captains who had come and gone from naval service, other conflicts that had flared and subsided across the Channel and along the northern coasts. She was, by every measure the age could offer, a survivor. And it is precisely this, the long, proven history of survival, the accumulated confidence of 34 years without catastrophe, that makes what followed so difficult even now to fully reconcile. Ships that have survived so much are not expected to founder in sight of their own harbour before the eyes of the king who commissioned them, on a calm July afternoon with no storm, no fire, no enemy boarding party to explain the sudden and total loss. The Mary Rose's long service was not a guarantee against disaster. It was in the end simply a long delay before the particular convergence of circumstance that no amount of proven history could prevent. A delay during which the ship's altered proportions, her accumulated weight, her modified balance, waited quietly beneath the surface of ordinary confidence. Waited for the specific combination of wind and water and turning maneuver that would finally reveal what 3 decades of incremental change had actually done to the vessel that everyone, including perhaps the ship's own commanders, had come to trust without question. By the middle of July in the year 1545, that convergence had not yet arrived, though the conditions that would produce it were already gathering in the most literal sense upon the waters east of the Isle of Wight. A French fleet, larger than any that had approached English shores in living memory, moved slowly toward the Solent under a sky the colour of pewter. Estimates of its size varied then, as they vary now among historians, but the contemporary accounts agree on a scale that would have been genuinely alarming to anyone standing on the ramparts of Portsmouth and watching the horizon fill with sail. Some 200 vessels, by certain counts, galleys and carracks and transport ships, carrying soldiers enough to threaten invasion, not merely raid. This was not a skirmish assembling itself. This was King Francis I of France, having concluded that Henry's recent adventures on the continent, his capture of Boulogne the year before, demanded an answer delivered directly to English soil, or as close to it as a fleet could bring an army. The English had known this was coming in the way that one knows weather is coming, through signs accumulating over weeks, through reports carried by scouts and merchant captains, through the low murmur of preparation that had been building along the south coast since spring. Portsmouth itself had been fortified with the urgency such news demanded. Sassy Castle, new built and still smelling faintly of fresh mortar, stood ready at the harbour mouth. The chain that could be drawn across the entrance to block enemy ships had been readied, though it would remain unused this particular summer, as if the town itself understood that the coming battle would be fought within sight of land, but not upon it. But not upon it. The English fleet, such as it was, had been mustered with whatever speed the Crown could manage. Assembly of perhaps 80 vessels, a number that sounds substantial, until set against the French approach, and which included ships of every size and provenance, some purpose-built for war, others merchant vessels hastily fitted with additional guns and pressed into service for the emergency. They gathered in the waters off Portsmouth through the early days of July, anchoring and re-anchoring as tides and orders shifted. A slow accumulation of masts that from a distance might have resembled a forest transplanted onto water, dense and swaying and waiting. Among them, unmistakable even at anchor, rode the Mary Rose. 34 years old that summer, she had been refitted more than once in the years since her launch, her upper works raised, her armament increased in the fashion of the times, so that she carried more guns now than she had as a younger ship, more weight, riding higher above her waterline. None of this troubled the men who prepared her for battle that July. Why would it have? She had sailed through storms and skirmishes alike, had carried King Henry's ambitions across the Channel and back again, had earned in 3 decades of service the particular kind of trust that accumulates around anything that has simply endured. The ship rode at anchor among her fellows, her sides freshly painted, her gun ports closed against the swell, waiting for the order that would send her out to meet whatever the French fleet intended. The atmosphere along the coast in those days had a quality that survives faintly in the letters and reports that have come down through the centuries. Attention held carefully in check the particular alertness of a population that has done what it can to prepare. Signal fires stood ready on the high points along the coast, unlit as yet, but tended, watched, prepared for the moment when scouts would confirm what everyone already suspected, that the French were closer than the day before, and closer still than the day before that. Small boats moved between the anchored ships and the shore, carrying messages, carrying supplies, carrying the ordinary business of a fleet preparing itself for something that had not yet become inevitable but had ceased, days before, to be merely possible. It was in this atmosphere, this slow gathering of consequence, that Vice Admiral George Carew took up his command of the Mary Rose. Carew was not a young man new to the sea, nor was he by the standards of the day an old one. He stood at that particular midpoint in a naval career where experience has accumulated without yet calcifying into caution, where a man has seen enough to trust his own judgment and not yet so much that he has learned to fear it. He came from a family with deep roots in service to the Crown, the kind of lineage that produced generation after generation, men suited to exactly this sort of appointment, trusted, capable, connected enough to be given command of one of the fleet's most storied vessels, and experienced enough, in the eyes of his king, to be worthy of that trust. What survives of Carew in the historical record is fragmentary, as so much from this period is fragmentary, pieced together from official correspondence and the occasional personal letter that happened to be preserved rather than lost to time, or damp or simple neglect. But the fragments suggest a man aware of the weight of his commission, aware too, perhaps, of the peculiar vulnerability of command, that a vice admiral's fate becomes bound to his ship in a way that a common sailor's does not, that the decisions made on deck in the coming hours would be remembered, if remembered at all. Whatever the outcome, he would have known the Mary Rose by reputation, if not yet intimately by feel, would have understood her as the fleet understood her, as a proven vessel, a survivor, a ship that had done this before and could be trusted to do it again. There is no indication in anything that survives that he approached his new command with anything but the calm confidence appropriate to the occasion. A man taking up a post he had every reason to believe he was equal to, aboard a ship he had every reason to believe was equal to its task. The crew who boarded alongside him in those days before the battle numbered somewhere near 400 souls, though precision here, as with so much else from this period, remains elusive. They came from every corner of the social order that Tudor England maintained with such careful gradation. There were soldiers, archers among them trained in the old English longbow, even as newer weapons proliferated around them. Men who would fight from the ship's decks, and rigging much as their counterparts might have fought from a castle wall, adapting land warfare to a floating platform. There were gunners, a smaller and more specialized cohort responsible for the ship's expanded artillery, men whose skills were increasingly valuable as naval warfare shifted toward gunnery and away from the older tactics of boarding and hand-to-hand combat. And there were sailors, the men who actually worked the ship, who understood her rigging and her particular temperament, who had perhaps served aboard her for years and knew her creaks and settlings the way one knows the sounds of a familiar house at night. Some among this crew had chosen the sea as their trade, had come to this muster as men who understood themselves to be sailors first and combatants second, or perhaps did not distinguish between the two at all. Others had been pressed into service, a common enough practice in an age when the Crown's need for manpower did not always align neatly with the willingness of the men required to fill it. These pressed men, fishermen taken from their boats, labourers taken from the docks, young men taken from whatever ordinary life they had been living before the French fleet made its presence known, brought to the ship a different quality of experience, less practiced perhaps, but no less human in their hopes of returning home once this particular emergency had passed. Veterans stood alongside novices in this arrangement, the seasoned alongside the untested, all of them bound together now by the simple fact of having been assigned to the same wooden hull, the same rigging, the same fate, whatever that fate would prove to be. They boarded, by most accounts, without any particular sense of foreboding, or if foreboding existed among them, it has not survived in any form that reaches us now. This was, after all, a proven ship, captained by a man of proven family, sailing as part of a fleet that outnumbered the enemy in experience, if not in raw numbers, defending home waters that every sailor aboard knew intimately. Whatever fear attended the coming battle would have been the ordinary fear of combat, not the specific fear of catastrophe from an unexpected quarter. No one climbing the Mary Rose's boarding ladders in those July days imagined that the ship beneath their feet, the ship that had carried 3 decades of English pride and ambition, harbored within her modified structure a vulnerability that no one aboard could see or measure or guard against. And watching all of this, watching the fleet gather, the ships take on their crews, the slow accumulation of preparation resolve itself into readiness, stood King Henry himself, present in person at Southsea Castle, a detail that later generations would find almost unbearably poignant, though nothing in the moment itself suggested tragedy. Henry had travelled to Portsmouth, specifically to observe his fleet, to be seen observing it, in the manner expected of a monarch whose personal prestige had become entangled with naval success in ways both practical and symbolic. From the castle's vantage point, newly built and still raw, with the recent work of its construction, he could look out across the anchored ships and see among them the vessel that had carried his name and his ambitions across so many years, 34 years now, nearly the whole span of his reign, a ship that had become, in some sense, that exceeded mere naval utility, a floating emblem of his rule itself. There is something in this image, the king at his castle window, the fleet arrayed before him, the French approaching somewhere beyond the horizon's grey curtain, that later centuries would return to again and again, reading into it a foreshadowing that the moment itself did not contain. Henry watched that July, not because he anticipated disaster, but because he anticipated triumph, or at minimum, competent defense. The ordinary confidence of a king reviewing forces he had every reason to trust. The ships rode at anchor. The crews settled into their positions. The signal fires waited unlit along the coast. And somewhere beyond the grey water to the east, the French fleet continued its slow approach, indifferent to the particular history riding at anchor in the waters it was sailing toward, indifferent to the king watching from his castle, indifferent to everything except the simple fact of its own advance, drawing nearer with each hour, drawing the moment closer without hurry, as the sea itself so often does, patient and unbothered by the human dramas unfolding upon its surface. The morning of July the 19th arrived, pale and uncertain, the light coming up slowly over the Solent, as it always did in high summer, without drama, without omen, a light that revealed nothing of what the day intended. The wind was light, barely enough to fill a sail, shifting in small, uncertain gusts that came and went like a held breath. This alone would shape everything that followed. A fleet under full sail depends on wind the way a body depends on air, and on this particular morning, the air was thin and undecided, neither committing to stillness nor to any steady direction, leaving the great ships of both nations to work with what little the sky offered them. The French had anchored their galleys apart from the main body of their fleet, and it was these galleys, oar-driven and unbothered by the failing wind, that came forward first. They moved with a kind of insolence that the English found unsettling, sliding across the water on their banks of oars, needing no wind at all, probing the edges of the English line the way a hand might probe a wound to see how deep it ran. The galleys carried guns in their bows, and they used them, firing at long range into the anchored English ships, then withdrawing before any reply could be organized, then returning to fire again. It was not yet a battle in the full sense. It was a testing, a series of small provocations meant to draw the English fleet out from the shelter of the harbour mouth and into open water where the larger French numbers might tell. King Henry's ships did not want to be drawn. They held their position through the early hours, watching the galleys circle and fire and withdraw, absorbing the harassment, because the alternative, moving out into open water under such uncertain wind, risked far more than the sting of long-range shot. But a fleet cannot simply endure forever. There is a point at which stillness becomes its own kind of danger, when the appearance of passivity begins to look, even to one's own men, like fear. And so, as the morning wore on, and the galleys grew bolder, the order came for the English fleet to advance and engage. The Mary Rose took her position among the ships moving forward, her sails set to catch what wind there was, her gun ports opened along both sides of her hull, the dark mouths of her guns run out and ready. She was not alone in this. The entire fleet was arranging itself into the shape of battle, ships finding their places in a loose formation that would allow them to bring their broadsides to bear on the approaching French vessels, the whole maritime machinery of the kingdom assembling itself into something like a single body. Moving forward under sail and oar toward a confrontation that neither side had yet fully committed to, but which both now seemed to expect. The ship that morning carried a burden greater than she had ever carried before. Soldiers had been brought aboard in numbers beyond her usual complement. Men-at-arms and archers packed onto her decks in preparation for what everyone assumed would be a day of close engagement. Boarding actions, the grim work of hand-to-hand combat that still in that era often decided naval battles as much as gunfire did. These additional men brought additional weight, and weight on a ship already carrying decades of accumulated modification. Added decking, added guns, added iron was not a small thing. She sat lower in the water than she once had. She responded more slowly to her helm. She required, though no one aboard her that morning would have phrased it this way, a greater margin of care than she had once needed, a narrower tolerance for error. Her gun ports, opened to allow her cannon to fire, sat closer to the waterline than they would have when she was first built, modifications and additions of her lifetime having gradually eroded the safe distance between the sea. This was not itself unusual. Warships of her era routinely fought with gun ports open near the waterline. It was an accepted risk, a calculated trade of safety margin for firepower, made by shipwrights and captains who understood the danger and judged it acceptable under normal sailing conditions, in normal wind, at a normal angle of heel. The danger existed not in the gun ports themselves, but in the possibility of the ship tilting far enough, quickly enough, unexpectedly enough, to bring those openings below the surface before they could be closed. It was a possibility. It had always been a possibility, on most days, under most conditions. It never became more than that. From his position at Southsea Castle overlooking the waters where his fleet now maneuvered, King Henry watched the entire scene unfold like a vast pageant arranged for his benefit. The ships of his navy, sails filling and slackening with the uncertain wind, moved across the water in their loose formations. Guns run out, banners visible even at this distance, the whole spectacle possessing the theatrical grandeur that Henry himself had always cultivated, whether in matters of state or matters of war. He had built this fleet. He had funded its ships, appointed its officers, staffed it with soldiers drawn from across his kingdom. Now he stood at the shore and watched it perform the function for which it had been built, watched his navy meet the French threat that had sailed into English waters with such evident intention. Accounts from that day, preserved in fragments across French and English records, offer glimpses of how the battle appeared to those present. A French naval commander, writing later of the engagement, described the English fleet's advance with the measured attention of a professional observer, noting the arrangement of the ships, the exchange of fire between the galleys and the larger vessels, the general character of an engagement that remained through its opening hours. More probing than decisive. His account, like most surviving descriptions of that morning, carries the flat, procedural tone of a man recording events rather than dramatizing them, a soldier's report rather than a storyteller's embellishment. Tret. There is no suggestion in these early accounts that anyone present expected the day to produce the loss that it did. The engagement proceeded, in its first hours, as engagements of this kind generally proceeded, exchanges of fire at range, maneuvering for position, the slow accumulation of small tactical adjustments, as both fleets tested the other's intentions. The Mary Rose moved forward with the rest of the English fleet, her guns beginning to answer the French fire, her decks crowded with the soldiers who would, everyone assumed, eventually be needed for boarding actions or repelling boarders of their own. The wind continued its uncertain behavior, filling her sails in gusts, then falling away, then returning from a slightly different quarter, requiring constant small adjustments from her crew, constant attention to trim and heading that would, under steadier conditions, have been unnecessary. It was the kind of day that demanded more from a crew than they might have anticipated when they woke that morning, a day of minor corrections and continuous vigilance rather than dramatic maneuvering, the sailors working the ropes and sails with the patient competence of men who had done this work for years. Unaware that the ordinary skills they were exercising were about to be tested by something beyond the ordinary. At some point in the unfolding engagement, the order came, or the necessity arose, for the Mary Rose to turn. The exact reason has never been established with certainty. Some accounts suggest she was maneuvering to bring her opposite broadside to bear on an approaching French vessel, seeking to answer fire from a new angle after her first guns had been discharged. Others suggest simple repositioning within the fleet's formation, an adjustment of her place among the other ships as the battle's shape continued to shift. Whatever the specific tactical purpose, the ship began to come about, her rudder turning, her sails catching the wind from a new angle, as her bow swung across the water, and her whole considerable bulk began the slow process of changing direction. It was in this turn that the wind chose to shift again, catching her sails from an angle that pushed against her hull, with a suddenness the earlier gusts had not possessed. The ship heeled, tilting to one side under the pressure, the way any sailing vessel heels when wind strikes its canvas at an angle, a motion so ordinary, so built into the fundamental physics of sail, that it would not on any other day, under any other combination of circumstances, have merited a second thought from the men standing on her decks. She had heeled 1,000 times before in her 34 years afloat. She would heel, again, they would have assumed, 1,000 times more. But this heel came at the precise moment when her gun ports, already lower than they had once been, already carrying the accumulated weight of decades of modification and the additional burden of soldiers crowded onto her decks, tilted further toward the waterline than they had ever tilted with those ports open. The sea, which had waited patiently through 34 years of the ship's service, through storms and campaigns and long years at anchor, through everything that had been asked of her and everything she had endured, found in this ordinary turn, this routine adjustment of sail and helm that any ship might have made on any day, the particular combination of angle and weight and opening that it required. The gun ports began to dip toward the water. The turn continued. The wind held its new angle, and the Mary rose in the midst of a battle that had, until this moment, produced nothing more than an exchange of long-range fire, and a great deal of maneuvering, began to tilt further than she should have, further than her crew could correct, further than the sea would allow her to recover from. Her bow still swinging through the turn that her helm had ordered, her sails still catching wind that pushed her deeper into the angle from which there would be no returning. It happened, those who watched from the shore would later say, without any single dramatic instant that the eye could seize upon. There was no crack of splitting timber, no visible collision, no sudden violence that announced itself as catastrophe. There was only the ship continuing the turn she had already begun, leaning a degree further than the moment before, and then another degree, the change so gradual that a man watching casually might have looked away and looked back to find the world already different. The sea on that afternoon was patient. It did not rush toward the Mary Rose. It waited for her to come to it, and she did, inch by inch, her deck tilting toward the water with the slow inevitability of a door swinging shut. The gun ports, cut low along her sides to allow her heaviest cannon to fire close to the waterline, had been opened for the battle that was already underway. This had been standard practice, unremarkable, the same arrangement that had served ships of her kind for years. In calm conditions, in a ship's sailing level, the ports sat well above the sea, and the water lapped harmlessly beneath them. But the Mary Rose was no longer sailing level. As she heeled into her turn, the ports that had cleared the water by a comfortable margin began to close that margin, the sea rising toward the openings, not because the sea had changed, but because the ship had tilted the openings down to meet it. Those responsible for the gun ports, if they attempted at this stage to close them, found themselves already too late, or too occupied with other urgent matters, or simply unaware of how quickly a small, steady lean could gather into something the ship could not shake off. The water entered quietly. This is worth saying plainly, because it is the detail that later generations have found most difficult to absorb about disasters of this kind. There was no explosion of the sea bursting through a broken hull, no dramatic flood bursting a hole in the wood. There was instead a kind of patience to it, an almost domestic quality, the sea finding an opening that had been left available to it and beginning to pour through in a manner not unlike water, finding a gap beneath a door. It came in low, along the row of open ports nearest the waterline, entering the lower decks where the great guns sat, and where the gun crews moments before occupied with the ordinary business of loading and readying their pieces for another exchange, now found the deck beneath them beginning to gather water around their ankles. At first, perhaps, it seemed a manageable thing. Ships took on water constantly. A wet deck was no cause for panic, but the water did not stop. The ship did not right herself, and within a very short span of time, measured by those who study the wreck today in minutes, rather than the longer span that memory sometimes assigns to catastrophe, the trickle became a volume that no bailing, no shifting of weight, no frantic correction could answer. The sea entered quietly, and then all at once, the ship's own lean drawing, more water in through each passing moment, the weight of that water adding to the list, the increasing list opening the ports further, each factor feeding the next in a spiral that no single order from the deck could have arrested once it had properly begun. Aboard the ship, the scene that unfolded resists easy description. Not because it was uniquely chaotic, battles and disasters at sea were rarely calm affairs, but because so few reliable accounts survive to tell us precisely what was shouted, by whom, and in what order. What can be said with reasonable confidence, drawn from the few surviving testimonies and from the physical evidence the ship herself would later yield, is that there was shouting, that orders were given and countermanded. That men below decks, who had been intent on the mechanics of loading and firing their guns, now found themselves grappling with a far more immediate emergency, and that the ship's list, once established, proved impossible to correct by any means available to those aboard her. Guns that had been secured for firing, heavy pieces of iron and bronze, lashed or braced against their carriages, began to shift with the incline. A cannon weighing far more than any man or group of men could easily restrain does not remain politely in place when the deck beneath it tilts past a certain angle. It slides, and where it slides, it adds its weight to the low side of the ship, worsening the very list that set it moving in the first place. Whether guns broke loose entirely on the Mary Rose that afternoon remains a matter of some debate among those who have studied her wreck, but the physics of the situation suggests strongly that any unsecured weight aboard, guns, shot, stores, the men themselves, would have begun to migrate toward the lower side as the ship heeled. Dock-and-pounding a problem that was already by this point beyond correction. Men below decks, in the confined and increasingly waterlogged space of the gun decks, faced a particular horror that deserved to be stated without exaggeration, because the plain facts carry weight enough. The decks of a ship like the Mary Rose were low, cramped, designed for the operation of heavy guns rather than for ease of movement, and as the ship inclined and the water rose, those working in these spaces found themselves in an environment rapidly becoming unnavigable, footing lost on a slanting wet deck, the light from above growing strange as the angle of the ship changed the relationship between deck and sky. Whatever orders were shouted to abandon these positions, and it is reasonable to assume such orders were given, the physical reality of escaping a lower gun deck on a rapidly listing ship, with water pouring in and the ship's angle worsening by the second, offered little room for calm or orderly retreat. Above decks, meanwhile, another obstacle awaited those who might otherwise have had a reasonable chance of reaching open water and swimming clear. It had become common practice on warships of the period to rig netting above the open deck, stretched from the rails to the rigging, intended to prevent enemy boarders from leaping down onto the deck during close combat, and to provide the ship's own men some measure of protection during the press of hand-to-hand fighting that naval engagements sometimes produced. This netting, a sensible defensive measure under the circumstances for which it had been designed, now became something else entirely, and, as the ship rolled and men above decks sought to escape into open water, the netting that had been meant to keep enemies out proved just as effective at keeping the ship's own crew in. Archaeological evidence recovered centuries later would lend grim confirmation to what survivors' accounts suggested, that a number of those aboard, in their final moments, found themselves tangled in the very rigging meant to protect them, unable to break free before the ship went under, the netting holding them as surely as any restraint could have done. The roll continued. Whatever hope remained that the Mary Rose might yet settle into some stable, if uncomfortable, attitude, listing badly but afloat, perhaps recoverable given time and effort, dissolved as the list passed the point from which any ship of her design could have returned. Water now rushed the decks in earnest, no longer entering quietly through gun ports alone, but sweeping over the rails themselves as the ship's angle brought the sea up to meet the open deck. The transition from a wounded listing vessel to a foundering one was, by all indications, swift. Those aboard who had maintained some hope of correcting the situation, of somehow bringing the ship back to an even keel through sheer effort and will, would have felt that hope collapse in these final moments as the sea that had been patiently rising along her side now simply came aboard, claiming the deck itself. The masts, still carrying sail, would have added their own weight to the ship's downward roll, the tall rigging acting almost as a lever, hastening the capsize once the point of no return had been passed. men in the rigging, men on deck, men still trapped below. All now experienced the ship's final movement together, though from vastly different vantage points and with vastly different chances of survival. The sea did not take long to close over her. Those who study the disaster today, working from the physical evidence of how she came to rest and from what testimony exists, generally agree that the Mary Rose went from a stricken, listing ship to one entirely lost beneath the surface within a span that can be measured in minutes, a brutal brevity that offered little time for the kind of organized evacuation that might, under other circumstances, have saved a great many more of the men aboard her. From the shore, at Southsea Castle, King Henry watched this unfold. He had come to observe his fleet in what should have been a moment of pride and confidence, the Mary Rose sailing out to meet the French with the same competence she had shown for over 3 decades. What he witnessed instead was the ship tilting, then rolling, then vanishing beneath the water in the span of what must have felt, even from a considerable distance, like an unbearably short passage of time. The accounts of his reaction that have survived are brief and should be treated with the caution appropriate to second-hand reports recorded after the fact, but they consistently describe a king overcome with grief and horror at what he had seen, a reaction that requires no embellishment to carry its weight. He is said to have cried out at the sight, though the precise words attributed to him vary across the sources and cannot be confirmed with certainty. More striking, perhaps, than any account of the king's own words are the reports, again impossible to verify fully, but persistent across multiple second-hand tellings, that the cries of the drowning men could be heard from the shore, carried across the water in the strange way that sound sometimes travels over a calm sea. Whether this detail is precisely accurate or whether it has been shaped and sharpened by the retelling of centuries, it carries a truth that does not depend on verification, that a great many men died within sight and perhaps within hearing of the land, within sight of a fleet that could do nothing in those final minutes but watch. The Mary Rose, which had served through 34 years of voyages, refits, and one battle after another without serious incident, had gone down in a matter of minutes in home waters before the eyes of the very monarch she had been built to serve. The surface of the Solent did not remain violent for long. Those who watched from the shore and from the decks of nearby ships would later struggle to describe how quickly the water settled, how soon the churning collapse of the ship's descent gave way to something almost gentle, a spreading calm, broken only by scattered debris. The masts had gone under with a great exhalation of air and spray, and then, within what witnesses guessed to be less than a minute, the Solent had resumed its ordinary rhythm, as though the sea itself were indifferent to what it had just taken. Timber floated free, planking, a broken yard, fragments of the rigging that had trapped so many below. Here and there, a piece of canvas lay spread upon the water, like something discarded rather than lost. The netting that had been strung above the deck to repel boarders, the very feature that had made the Mary Rose formidable in close engagement, now held its grim purpose in reverse, and beneath the floating wreckage, unseen from the surface, men remained tangled in its mesh, unable to rise. For those still living in the water, the moments after the sinking were a matter of desperate improvisation. A few had been thrown clear as the ship rolled, flung from the decks into open water where at least the netting could not hold them. Others had managed to reach the surface through the ship's high exposed side, the aftercastle still angled above the waterline in the final moments, offering a narrow path upward for those quick enough or fortunate enough to take it. Survivors clung to what they could find: a spar, a length of rope, a floating chest that had broken loose from the hold. Some held to the rigging itself, the same lines that had doomed so many of their crewmates, now serving as a precarious raft for those who had managed to reach open water rather than being pulled down within the ship's frame. Nearby vessels moved to help as quickly as the confusion allowed. Small boats were lowered from the escort ships. Oars pulled hard across the short stretch of water that separated the fleet from the place where the Mary Rose had gone down. Sailors leaned over gunwales, reaching for hands, for wrists, for anything that could be gripped and hauled upward. It cannot have been an orderly rescue. The Solent was littered with wreckage, with drowning men and men already lost, with the particular chaos of a catastrophe that had given almost no warning and allowed almost no preparation. Boats had to pick their way through debris, uncertain in the first minutes whether they were pulling the living from the water or recovering the dead. Men, hauled aboard rescue boats, were beyond reviving, having taken in too much water in the moments before help arrived. Others survived only because a boat had been near enough, quick enough, and fortunate enough to reach them before exhaustion or cold pulled them under. The final count would remain imprecise, as counts of catastrophe so often do, but the historical record converges on a devastating proportion. Of some 500 men who had been aboard the Mary Rose that afternoon, only a small number survived. Accounts suggest perhaps 30, though the true figure may never be established with certainty. It was not merely that many died, it was that nearly everyone died. A crew that in ordinary circumstances would have included gunners, archers, soldiers, sailors, officers, and the ship's own specialized hands. Men who understood the particular rigging and quirks of this specific vessel after years of service together was, in the span of minutes, almost entirely erased. The knowledge held by that crew, the accumulated experience of years at sea together, the personal histories of 500 individual lives, vanished into the Solent within sight of the shore. Among the dead, historical accounts suggest, were not only the fighting men and sailors typically counted in a ship's muster, but also a number of women who had been aboard, camp followers or family members, present for reasons that the surviving records do not fully explain. The presence of women on English warships of this period was not standard practice, and the accounts that mention them are fragmentary, filtered through later retellings, and the uncertain reliability of testimony gathered after chaos and grief. But if the tradition holds even partial truth, it adds another layer to the tragedy, that among the men trained for war and accustomed to its risks, there may also have been those who had no part in the battle at all, present perhaps to bring food, to tend to some domestic need of the ship, to simply accompany a husband or son on what should have been an unremarkable day of maneuvering rather than mortal combat. Their names, if they were ever recorded, have not survived. Their presence remains one of the quieter uncertainties in an event otherwise documented with unusual thoroughness for its time. From the shore, from the decks of the ships that had watched the Mary Rose roll and vanish, the disbelief was immediate and total. Great ship, one of the most powerful vessels in the English fleet, a ship that had served the king for 34 years, that had sailed to France and back, that had weathered storms and skirmishes and the ordinary wear of decades at sea, had simply ceased to exist as a solid, visible thing. One moment, her masts had stood against the sky, her sails catching what wind there was, her guns run out for the engagement that had seemed only minutes before to be unfolding in the ordinary manner of naval maneuver. The next moment, there was only water, debris, and the terrible silence where her presence had been. Weld. Witnesses would later describe the strange quiet that followed, not the quiet of an empty sea which carries its own particular texture, but the quiet of an absence, keenly felt, a silence made heavier by what had just been removed from the scene. The French fleet, positioned to engage, seems to have paused as well, uncertain how to interpret what they had witnessed, perhaps caught in the same disbelief that gripped the English watchers. For a time, the business of naval engagement was suspended entirely, both fleets absorbing the same impossible fact. that a warship, undamaged by enemy fire, had gone down in home waters, in calm conditions, within a matter of minutes before any shot had struck her that could account for such a loss. King Henry, watching from Southsea Castle, is said to have witnessed the entire event, the ship's list, her failure to right herself, the final roll and disappearance beneath the surface. Whatever his private response, the accounts describe a king stunned into a silence of his own. The pageantry of the day's planned engagement rendered suddenly meaningless against the scale of what had just occurred. The battle that had been meant to demonstrate England's naval strength to an invading French fleet had instead produced a demonstration of an entirely different kind. The vulnerability of even the most formidable ship to forces not fully understood, the fragility beneath the imposing surface of wood and cannon and canvas. In the hours that followed, as the shock began to settle into something more like grief and inquiry, the first theories emerged, offered by survivors, by officers on nearby vessels, by anyone who had witnessed enough to venture a guess at what had gone wrong. The most immediate and persistent explanation centered on the ship's balance in the water. The Mary Rose had recently undergone alterations. Her armament increased, additional guns added to decks that may not have been designed to bear such weight without compromising her stability. Some who had served aboard her, or who had observed her in the days before the battle, suggested she rode lower in the water than a ship of her design ought to, that the added weight of guns and supplies had left her margin for error dangerously thin. Others pointed to the turn itself, the maneuver that had been standard practice executed countless times by countless ships, but which on this occasion had coincided with an unexpected gust, a shift in wind that caught her at the precise moment when she was most vulnerable, heeled over with her lower gun ports open and unable to correct before the water began pouring in. Whether this gust was in fact stronger or more sudden than the conditions typically encountered during such a maneuver, or whether the ship's already compromised stability meant that even an ordinary gust proved fatal, the survivors and witnesses could not agree, and the passage of time would do little to resolve the question. A third explanation, offered more quietly and with more discomfort, concerned human error, the possibility that the lower gun ports, opened to allow the ship's most powerful guns to bear on the approaching French vessels, had not been closed quickly enough. Whether through miscommunication, through the ordinary confusion of battle preparation, or through some more specific failure of seamanship, the ports may have remained open as the ship heeled, allowing the sea to enter in a rush that no bailing or countermeasure could have overcome once it began. This explanation carried its own particular weight, for it suggested not an act of nature or an unfortunate combination of circumstances, but a mistake, a lapse that, in different circumstances, might have been caught and corrected, might have cost nothing at all. None of these theories could be confirmed in the hours after the sinking, and none would be fully confirmed for centuries afterward. What was certain in that first evening was only the fact of the loss itself. The ship gone, the men gone, the Solent settling back into its ordinary calm as though nothing at all had happened upon its surface that afternoon. By evening, as the light began to fail over Portsmouth, and the fleet regrouped to consider what the day's disaster meant for the battle still technically underway, the water above the Mary Rose had grown still. Below the surface, in the soft mud of the Solent's floor, the ship had already begun the long process of settling into the silt that would, over the centuries to come, both preserve and conceal her. While the masts that had once stood above the waterline, marking her position for any who cared to look, gradually succumbed to the tides and to time breaking away or rotting until no visible trace remained above the surface. The Solent, indifferent as ever to the events it had witnessed, closed quietly over the wreck, and the ship that had served a king for 34 years began her long transformation, from vessel to relic, from tragedy to mystery, resting now in the dark and settling silt where she would remain, mostly undisturbed. for more centuries than she had ever spent afloat. The king had watched it happen from Southsea Castle, a low stone fortification raised only recently upon the shore, its walls still pale with new mortar, its purpose to guard the very stretch of water in which his ship now lay broken. Henry Tudor was a man accustomed to spectacle arranged for his benefit, to triumph staged and outcomes secured in advance, and what he witnessed instead was catastrophe unfolding in real time before his court, before his allies, before the eyes of the French whose fleet had come to test his kingdom's resolve. The accounts that survive describe his reaction only in fragments, second-hand and softened by the caution of those who wrote them, but the fragments agree on this much, that the king cried out that his grief was immediate and unguarded. The men who had planned this day's engagement with such careful confidence found themselves unable to offer comfort because there was none to offer. A flagship had gone down in home waters, in sight of the shore, in front of the sovereign whose pride she had been built to embody, and no amount of courtly composure could soften what had just occurred. The political weight of the disaster settled quickly, even as the physical wreckage was still settling into the mud below. England was at war, actively engaged with a French invasion fleet that remained for the moment very much present in the Solent, and the loss of the Mary Rose was not merely a private grief to be mourned in quiet chambers. It was a public wound, visible to allies and enemies alike. Demonstration of vulnerability at the precise moment when strength needed to be shown. Word of the sinking would travel quickly along the coast, then inland, then across the channel to courts that had their own reasons to take satisfaction in England's misfortune. For a king whose reign had been defined, in part by naval ambition, by the deliberate cultivation of a fleet meant to project power and permanence, the loss of his finest and most storied vessel, sunk not by enemy action in any confirmed sense, and, mischance, was an embarrassment that could not be easily explained away. And so, even as the grief was still fresh, the search began, not for survivors, for it was already clear that few would be found, but for the ship herself, for whatever might yet be salvaged from the wreck before the sea claimed it entirely. The efforts that followed, in the days and weeks after the sinking, reveal both the urgency of the moment and the profound limitations of the age. Divers were sent down, men whose method of working the depths bore little resemblance to anything a later century would recognize as diving in the technical sense. They worked without apparatus, beyond their own held breath, descending on lines guided by touch and rough estimation in water that was cold, dark, and thick with the churned sediment of the collision and sinking. Some accounts speak of Venetian salvage experts brought in for their reputed skill, men experienced in the recovery of sunken cargo from Mediterranean wrecks, hired now to apply their methods to this cold northern water with its unfamiliar currents. Ropes were attached where they could be secured. Capstans were employed on accompanying vessels, straining to shift a hull that had settled at an angle into the seabed, already beginning to take on the weight of mud that would in time become her most effective preservation and her most stubborn obstacle. The attempts to raise her outright failed, and failed again. The technology of the age simply could not manage the recovery of a vessel of her size and weight, embedded as she was at an angle that made the application of force uneven and unpredictable. Lines snapped. Efforts to right her only seemed to settle her further, the suction of the mud working against every attempt to break her free. Within a matter of weeks, it became apparent that the hull itself, the great oak structure that had carried a king's ambitions across 3 decades of naval service, would not be recovered. What could be salvaged was smaller, more immediate, some of the guns brought up through repeated dives and painstaking effort, cannon that represented not only military value, but also the substantial cost of bronze and iron that no monarch, however grieved, wished to abandon to the seabed if recovery remained possible. Rigging was gathered where it floated free or hung loose enough to be cut and drawn to the surface. Some personal effects, some fittings, a portion of what had made the ship a living vessel rather than a wreck. These were recovered in the immediate aftermath, brought ashore and accounted for in the meticulous manner that Tudor administration favoured even in moments of catastrophe. But the hull remained. Weeks became months, and the attempts to raise her diminished, then ceased altogether, the practical judgment eventually overtaking the emotional desire to reclaim what had been lost. The Mary Rose, or what remained of her, was left where she had settled, her upper works still visible above the waterline for a time, masts breaking the surface as a grim marker of the spot, until even that visible reminder began its slow disappearance beneath the tides. In the wake of the failed salvage, attention turned, as it so often does after disaster, toward explanation, toward the assignment of responsibility for what had gone wrong. An inquiry was convened, as protocol and political necessity demanded, and the surviving officers and witnesses were called upon to give their account of the sinking. The testimony that emerged was neither clear nor consistent, a scattering of impressions and accusations that reflected as much about the fears and loyalties of those speaking as about the actual sequence of events. Some blamed the crew, suggesting an unruliness among the sailors, a want of discipline that had left the ship poorly handled in the crucial moment of the turn. Others pointed toward the soldiers who had crowded her decks that day, men unfamiliar with the sea, whose presence in such numbers may have compromised the delicate balance a warship required, especially one already carrying the additional weight of her recent refit, her new guns. Her heightened structure built to project strength, but which may have compromised the very stability that strength depended upon. Vice Admiral Carew himself, who had gone down with his ship and could offer no defense of his own conduct, became a focal point of blame in some accounts. His final words, if the reports of his exchange with his uncle are to be trusted, taken as evidence that he himself recognized, in the last moment, some fault among his own crew, some failure of command, that even he could not correct once the water began pouring through the open gun ports. Other voices, more measured, pointed not toward individual failure, but toward the ship herself, toward the cumulative alterations made across her decades of service, the additional decks and guns layered onto a hull originally built for different specifications, a vessel modernized past what her original design could safely bear. This explanation, quieter and less satisfying to a court eager for a name to attach to blame, would in later centuries come to seem the most probable, though at the time it offered little comfort to a king who wanted answers rather than abstractions about structural strain and cumulative modification. No firm conclusion emerged from the inquiry that satisfied all parties, and this too is characteristic of disasters at sea, where the evidence sinks with the ship and testimony is shaped as much by grief and self-preservation as by clear memory. The blame settled, in the popular imagination, if not in any official decree, somewhat loosely across several possible causes: overloading, mishandling, poor discipline, structural compromise, without ever resolving into the kind of single, satisfying explanation that might have allowed the matter to be closed with confidence. Henry, for his part, is not recorded as having pursued the inquiry with any prolonged vigor. Whatever satisfaction might have come from identifying a scapegoat was perhaps outweighed by the political usefulness of allowing the matter to recede from public attention, particularly as the war with France continued to demand his focus and resources. A drowned vice admiral, already dead and already mourned, made for a convenient and merciful terminus to the search for blame, sufficient to close the matter without requiring further humiliation of the living. And so, gradually, the story of the Mary Rose began its long recession from immediate crisis into distant memory. The war with France concluded in its own time, as wars do, through treaty and exhaustion rather than through any decisive victory that might have redeemed the loss in the Solent. The court moved on to other concerns, as courts always must, and the ship that had been the pride of a king's navy became within a generation a story told rather than a wound still felt, a cautionary tale invoked in passing, a memory kept alive more by ballad and rumour than by any sustained official commemoration. Sailors passing through Portsmouth might point toward the waters where she had gone down, might repeat some version of the tale to those unfamiliar with it, embellishing details here, softening others there, until the account carried by word of mouth bore only a loose resemblance to the events any surviving witness might have recognized. Brief histories written in the decades that followed mentioned her usually in passing as an example of misfortune or as evidence of the dangers inherent in naval modernization, her name appearing in lists of losses without the weight of detail that might have kept her memory. Fragments of her story survived scattered across different kinds of records. Administrative accounts of the salvage attempts, brief mentions in later Tudor histories, the occasional ballad or verse that touched upon the tragedy in the manner such verses did, transforming specific loss into general lament, into a lesson about pride and the sea's indifference to human ambition. The details that had mattered so much in the days after the sinking, the names of those lost, the specific testimony of the inquiry, the precise sequence of the turn and the flooding, faded from common memory even as the broad outline of the tragedy persisted, kept alive by little more than the strange durability of a good story, however diminished in its particulars. The centuries that followed brought their own concerns, their own wars, and monarchs and maritime disasters, each competing for the limited attention any age grants to the tragedies of the one before it. Portsmouth continued its life as a naval town. Ships continued to be built and lost, and remembered or forgotten according to their own merits, and the specific waters where the Mary Rose lay became in time simply another stretch of the Solent, unremarkable to those who sailed above her, unless they happened to know, as a diminishing few did, that beneath the mud and the tide, something remained. The sea does not forget, but it does bury, and what it buries, it changes according to laws that have nothing to do with human memory. In the years immediately after that July afternoon in 1545, the Mary Rose settled into the seabed of the Solent at an angle, tilted to her starboard side, her masts gone or going, her upper decks open to the water in ways her builders had never intended. The tide moved through her broken hull the way it moved through the wreck of any ship, indifferent, patient, carrying with it the fine grey silt that is the particular signature of that stretch of English coast. This silt did not fall upon her all at once. It arrived in the manner that all quiet erasures arrive, gradually, repeatedly, so slowly that no single day could be said to mark the difference between a ship visible and a ship hidden. Tide by tide, storm by storm, the scour and deposit of the Solent's currents built a slope of sediment against her exposed port side, the side that had faced the sky as she rolled, while her starboard side, pressed down into the seabed by her own broken weight, sank deeper into the clay that had lain undisturbed for centuries before any keel was laid to build her. It is this accident of position, this half-burial rather than a clean burial, this awkward collapse rather than an orderly sinking, that would matter more than anyone alive in 1545 could have understood. The side of the ship, driven into the seabed, found itself over the following years sealed away from the oxygen that turns wood to nothing. Marine organisms that consume timber, the small creatures whose slow appetite reduces most wooden wrecks to scattered fragments, and eventually to nothing at all, require oxygen to do their work, and the silt that settled over the Mary Rose's buried half denied them what they needed. In the lightless, oxygen-poor environment beneath the accumulating sediment, The wood did not rot in the way wood rots when exposed to air and current, and the ordinary business of decay, it darkened. It softened at the cellular level even as it held its shape. It became, in the strange chemistry of anaerobic preservation, something closer to a wet sponge saturated with water molecules that had replaced, over centuries, the structural sugars the wood once held. But it held its shape. It held its lines, its joints, its carved details, in a manner that would have seemed impossible to the men who watched her go down, had any of them imagined that their grief and their scramble to save what swimmers they could would one day give way to an entirely different kind of recovery. Centuries removed, involving no drowning men at all. The upper works, the parts of the ship left exposed to open water, followed the more ordinary path. Wood-eaters and wood rot and the endless working of tide and current took the exposed timbers apart slowly across the years, so that within perhaps a few decades of the sinking, the visible shape of the Mary Rose above the seabed had begun to lose its coherence. The masts, if any survived the initial sinking at all, would not have lasted long against the currents of the Solent, a body of water that carries considerable force between the mainland and the Isle of Wight, funneling tide through a strait that has claimed other ships before and since. What remained standing eventually did not remain standing. It fell or it rotted at the base and toppled, or it simply wore away in the patient manner of all wood left exposed to salt water and time. Above this slow transformation, the world continued in the way the world continues, regardless of what lies beneath its surfaces. Henry himself would not live many more years past that July afternoon. He died in 1547, leaving behind a son too young to rule without regents, and a country that would spend the following years absorbed in questions of succession, religion, and the increasingly urgent matter of what England's relationship to the continent and to its own church would become. The Mary Rose, in these unfolding concerns, occupied no significant place. She had been a disaster, certainly, and a costly one, but disasters at sea were not uncommon in an age when ships were wooden and the sea was what it had always been, and the machinery of a kingdom does not pause long to mourn a single vessel, however grand her launching had once seemed. The decades passed into a century, and the century passed into others. Elizabeth came to the throne and built her own navy, one that would meet the Spanish Armada in 1588 and turn back what might have been for England, a catastrophe considerably larger than the loss of a single ship in home waters. The wars of the 17th century came and went. Civil war, the execution of a king, a commonwealth, a restoration, further wars against the Dutch, fought in waters not far from where the Mary Rose lay forgotten. Portsmouth itself grew as a naval town throughout these centuries, its docks and its harbour, expanding to serve a navy that had grown vastly larger and more complex than anything Henry could have imagined when he laid down the keel of his flagship. Ships were built in yards not far from where the Mary Rose had first taken shape, launched with the same hopeful ceremonies, sent to serve and sometimes to be lost in their turn, joining her in an unmarked fellowship of vessels the sea had claimed, and the record books noted only briefly before moving on to newer concerns. By the 18th century, an empire had begun to extend itself across oceans. The Tudor Navy had never dreamed of crossing in any organized way, and the Royal Navy that patrolled these expanding claims bore only the faintest ancestral resemblance to the fleet Henry had commanded from the shore at Southsea Castle. Trafalgar was fought and won in 1805, a battle that would come to occupy the kind of central place in the national memory of naval glory that the Mary Rose herself might once have been imagined to hold, had her story ended differently. The 19th century arrived, steam began its slow displacement of sail, and somewhere beneath the waters of the Solent, largely unvisited and entirely unmarked by any surface indication, the mound that had once been a warship continued its long, patient stillness. It was in this 19th century, amid all this unrelated progress, that the first serious attempts to locate the wreck emerged, though serious must be understood in the context of the diving technology then available, which was itself in only the earlier stages of the development that would eventually make full archaeological recovery possible. In 1836, fishermen's nets in the area began snagging on something below the surface, an obstruction that suggested to those who took an interest the possibility of wreckage worth investigating. This drew the attention of two brothers, John and Charles Dean, pioneers of early diving equipment who had developed a form of diving helmet connected by hose to air pumped from the surface that allowed a man to walk along a seabed for limited periods in a manner that would have seemed almost supernatural to divers of earlier generations, who had relied on holding their breath or on primitive diving bells that offered little freedom of movement. The Dean brothers, investigating the obstruction that had troubled the fishermen's nets, found timbers, and among the timbers objects, bronze guns, some of them beautifully cast and decorated in a style clearly Tudor rather than anything more recent, along with longbows and various other artifacts that suggested to those who examined them a wreck of considerable age and considerable significance. It did not take long for those with knowledge of local maritime history to connect what the Dean brothers were finding to the ship that local memory, however faded, still associated with the disaster witnessed by a king nearly 3 centuries before. The Mary Rose, in a limited and imperfect way, had been found, but found in 1836 meant something considerably less than what it would come to mean a century and a half later. The Dean brothers, working with the diving technology and the archaeological understanding of their era, approached the wreck not as a site to be carefully excavated and preserved for what it might reveal about Tudor England, but as a source of interesting and valuable objects to be recovered where recovery was practical. They brought up guns and other artifacts, working over a period of a few years in the late 1832 before turning their attention, as divers and salvagers of that era typically did, to more immediately profitable projects. Some of what they recovered found its way into private collections, some into the beginnings of what would become more organized museum holdings, and the site itself, having yielded what could be readily reached and readily valued according to the standards of that age. The Dean brothers' interest in the Mary Rose faded as their attention moved to other wrecks, other opportunities, and by the 1842, the site had returned to the obscurity it had known for the previous 3 centuries. Its exact location known to a diminishing handful of people, its larger significance not yet understood by anyone. There is something strange, considered across the distance of centuries, in the image of a king's flagship, a vessel launched with trumpets and blessing, carrying the personal pride of a monarch who had watched her built and had sailed in her himself, reduced to an unmarked mound of silt and timber beneath waters that pleasure boats and fishing vessels crossed without any awareness of what lay below. The ship that had been meant to embody the strength and modernity of Henry's England, built at extraordinary cost and rebuilt at further cost to keep her formidable, had become, in the long accounting of time, simply a shape in the mud, visited occasionally and only partially understood even by those who did visit her. Before slipping once more into the kind of silence that swallows most human endeavors, eventually, however grand their beginnings, it would take the 20th century and the technologies that century developed, sonar, more sophisticated diving apparatus, and eventually the underwater archaeological methods that transformed how such sites were approached and understood before the Mary Rose would be found again in any way that mattered. Before her rediscovery would become something more than another brief disturbance in a long forgetting. That rediscovery was still decades away in the 1842, still waiting on developments in technology and in archaeological thinking that no one of that earlier era could have anticipated. and so the ship waited. She waited through the remainder of the 19th century and into the disruptions of the 20th, through further wars fought in the waters near where she lay. Through the rise and contraction of the empire, her more distant naval descendants had helped to build and defend. Patient in the manner that only the drowned and the buried can be patient. Donned different to the passage of monarchs and the rearrangement of nations above her, waiting in the dark for the tide of human attention to turn back, eventually toward where she rested. It was in the years following the Second World War that the tide of attention did at last begin to turn back toward the Solent's mud, though it turned slowly, as such things do, drawn first by rumor and old records rather than by any certainty of what remained. The man most responsible for that turning was Alexander McKee, a journalist and amateur historian with a diver's patience and a habit of pursuing questions that other men had long since set aside. McKee had grown fascinated, in the manner of those who cannot leave old mysteries alone, with the accounts of the ship that had gone down in 1545 before the eyes of a king, and he began, in the early 1960 seconds, to ask a question that seems obvious only in hindsight. If she went down so close to shore, in waters so regularly used, why had no one gone looking for what remained? He was not a man of great institutional standing, nor did he command the resources of a naval expedition, and his early efforts were modest in the way that important beginnings often are. A small boat, borrowed equipment, long afternoons spent studying tide charts and 18th century salvage reports, trying to triangulate a position from documents that had not been written with future divers in mind. He formed a group, in time, calling it Project Solent Ships, and gathered around him a handful of others who shared his conviction that history did not dissolve simply because it had sunk. Among them was a young enthusiast whose energy would prove essential to the years of work ahead, though in those first seasons the work consisted mostly of disappointment. Long dives through poor visibility, sonar readings that promised much, and delivered mud, the particular fatigue of searching for something that 4 centuries of tide had worked to erase. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived not as a single dramatic instant, but as a slow accumulation of evidence, the way most true discoveries do. Sonar surveys in the mid-1960s began to reveal an anomaly on the seabed, mound where the bottom should have been flat, a shape too regular to be entirely natural. Divers descended to investigate, and what they found beneath the silt was not immediately spectacular. There was no looming hull rising dramatically from the sand, no timber ribs reaching up like something from an illustration. There was instead the faint suggestion of structure beneath a blanket of centuries, a firmness underfoot where there should have been only mud, a texture that resolved, on closer examination, into wood. It took years to be certain of what they had found, and those years were filled with the unglamorous labor that defines the best of archaeology, the slow grid-by-grid mapping of the site, the careful probing that avoided the temptation to dig hastily toward whatever lay beneath, the patient recording of every fragment before it was disturbed. The ship, they came to understand, had not simply sunk and settled on the bottom to await discovery whole. It had come to rest on her starboard side. Over the long span of centuries, the tide had done what tide does. It had scoured away the timbers of her exposed port side, the upper works long since dissolved into the sea's general economy of decay, while at the same time depositing silt and sand over the side that lay against the bottom, burying it, and in that burial, preserving it. The sea, in its patient indifference, had performed an accidental act of conservation. What divers found was not a ship in the way one might picture a ship, but rather half a ship, tilted and embedded, the lower hull and the starboard side intact beneath layers of protective mud, waiting in the dark like something folded away in a drawer no one had opened in 400 years. Confirming that this was, in fact, the Mary Rose, and not some other wreck from the long history of ships lost in those waters, required its own patient labor. The Solent had claimed many vessels over the centuries, and mud does not announce the name of what it holds. The divers brought up timbers for analysis, comparing their construction to what was known of Tudor shipbuilding, the particular methods of joinery, the type of oak, the style of fastenings that marked a vessel of that specific era rather than a later one. They recovered artifacts that spoke unmistakably of the 16th century: a leather shoe of a style no longer worn, a wooden bowl untouched by any modern tool, fragments of rope and rigging consistent with what a Tudor warship would have carried. Each object, brought slowly up through the water and laid out for examination, added its small weight to the growing certainty. There was no single moment of proof, no dramatic unveiling of a nameplate or a bell inscribed with her name, but rather a slow tightening of confidence, as fact after fact aligned with what history had recorded of her loss. By the early 1972, there was no longer serious doubt. The ship beneath the mud of the Solent was the Mary Rose, resting almost exactly where the old accounts had said she went down. What followed was a decision of considerable ambition, not merely to study the wreck where she lay, as most archaeology of the sea contents itself with doing, but to raise her entirely, to bring the hull itself up out of the water and into the air for the first time since that July afternoon in 1545. It was a proposal that carried enormous risk. The timbers, having spent 4 centuries submerged and waterlogged, were fragile in ways that ordinary wood is not. The wood itself had been slowly replaced, cell by cell, with water, so that what remained was less a solid structure than a structure held in suspension. A shape maintained as much by the water within it as by the strength of the fibers themselves. To lift such a thing carelessly would be to risk its collapse under its own weight the moment it left the sea that had paradoxically been both its destroyer and its preserver. The team that undertook the raising spent years preparing for a single operation that would last only hours, engineering a steel cradle fitted with padded supports shaped precisely to the contours of the hull, so that the ship's own weight would be distributed and cushioned rather than concentrated on any single fragile point. Divers worked through the cold and murk of the Solent to thread the necessary supports beneath the wreck, a task that required both mechanical precision and an almost tender care, given what was being handled. The plan called for the hull to be lifted first in the cradle to just below the surface, allowed to settle and be checked, and only then raised the final distance into open air. The day chosen for that final lift was the 11th of October 1982, and it drew an audience that no one who had begun the search 2 decades earlier could have fully anticipated. Millions watched by television as the crane's arm bore its slow and careful weight, the surface of the Solent breaking at last around a shape that had not touched daylight in 437 years. Among those watching, present at the scene itself, was a young Prince Charles, heir to the same crown that had watched the ship go down. Centuries before, a quiet symmetry that did not go unremarked upon. The monarchy once again present at a moment of the Mary Rose's fate, this time not to witness a loss, but to witness a return. The hull rose slowly, water sheeting from every timber, the wood dark and gleaming, and impossibly still intact after so long a burial. And there was, in that image, something that struck even those watching from a great distance with an emotion difficult to name precisely. Not celebration exactly, nor mourning, but something adjacent to both. The particular feeling that attends the sight of something long lost being returned, however altered, however fragile to the world of the living. The ship that emerged was not whole. It was a great fragment, tilted and truncated, its upper work long since given to the sea, but it was unmistakably a ship, unmistakably hers. and the sight of it dripping in the grey October light carried a weight that seemed to reach back across the centuries and touch. What followed the raising was not a triumphant unveiling, but the beginning of an even longer and more patient labour, the work of preservation which would occupy decades rather than years. The timbers, so long sustained by the water that had, also in another sense, been dissolving them slowly all along, could not simply be allowed to dry in open air. To do so would have caused them to crack and collapse, as the water left the wood too quickly, the delicate cellular structure unable to bear the sudden change. Instead, the hull was kept in a carefully controlled environment, first sprayed continuously with chilled water to prevent bacterial decay, and then, over the years that followed, treated with a slow and exacting regimen of polyethylene glycol, a wax-like substance introduced gradually into the wood to replace the water molecularly, cell by cell, so that the structure of the timber could be preserved, even as its original moisture was, with infinite patience drawn away. This process would continue for decades. The ship, housed within a specially constructed facility, watched over as attentively as she had once been watched over on the day of her launching, though this time the watching was measured not in hours but in years, then in decades, a conservation effort that would not fully conclude until the 21st century. Slowly, through that immense patience, the wreck became something else, no longer merely a hull recovered from the mud, but a preserved and stabilized artifact, ready at last to be presented not as a ruin, but as a vessel, still marked by all she had endured, resting now not on the seabed, but within walls built expressly to hold her. A Tudor warship, transformed by care and time into a kind of quiet monument, dry at last, and finally, after so long, at rest. What the sea had taken in a few violent minutes, the mud had kept whole for 400 years, and when at last it gave up what it held, it did not give it up as wreckage, but as a world. The silt that had entombed the Mary Rose was not simply a preservative in the abstract sense. It was an airless, oxygen-starved embrace that had settled over her decks within seasons of her sinking, sealing away wood, leather, cloth, and bone in a slow suffocation that, by denying decay the air it needed, had inadvertently granted the ship a second life in waiting. Divers and archaeologists working through the silt in the decades after her rediscovery did not simply find a hull. They found nearly 19,000 objects, each one lifted free of the clay, with the same care one might use to lift a sleeping child, each one a fragment of a morning in July that had otherwise vanished entirely from the record of things. Among the first and most striking discoveries were the longbows, more than 130 of them made of yew, some as tall as the men who once drew them, found still coiled in the postures of readiness, stacked in the racks where archers had left them only moments, it seemed, before the ship went down. Alongside them lay thousands of arrows, still bound in their sheaves, the fletching long since gone, but the shafts themselves intact, waiting in the dark for a battle that had already ended without them. To hold one of those bows, conservators would later say, was to feel the weight of a skill nearly lost to history. The specific strength required to draw such a weapon, a strength built over years of training that began, for most archers, in childhood. The bows did not merely confirm that England still relied on this ancient weapon in an age of gunpowder. They testified to bodies shaped by that reliance, spines and shoulders subtly deformed by decades of drawing immense tension, a history written not in words but in bone, waiting to be read once the men themselves were found. And the men were found, not as ghosts, not as legend, but as skeletons, remarkably preserved. 300 of them recovered from the wreck, each one a Tudor sailor who had gone into the water on that July afternoon and had lain in the same posture, more or less, until the day the sea gave him back. It is a strange thing to consider that the very disaster which killed them also protected them so completely, that centuries later scientists could study their bones and learn what medicine, injury, and daily labor had done to Tudor bodies with a precision that documents alone could never offer. Isotope analysis of teeth revealed where some of the crew had been born, not only in Portsmouth or London, but in warmer climates far to the south, hinting at a crew more international than the popular image of an English warship might suggest, men who had traveled far to serve, or been brought in as skilled hands regardless of origin. Bones told stories of old injuries healed and new ones sustained, of diets heavy in some nutrients and deficient in others, of a life that was physically demanding, often painful and remarkably short by modern standards, yet resilient in ways modern life rarely requires. Among the recovered dead was a man archaeologists came to call the Archer, not because his identity was known, for it never would be, but because the evidence of his skeleton told the story his name could not. His bones showed the telltale asymmetry of a lifetime spent drawing a longbow, his left arm bearing a wear pattern unlike any produced by ordinary labor, a signature etched slowly across years of training so demanding that only dedicated archers could bear it. He had likely begun that training as a boy, his skeleton adapting to the strain before it had even finished growing until his body itself had become a kind of instrument, shaped entirely around a task now understood by history books, but rarely felt in the bone. To stand before his remains, laid out in careful study, was to feel something rare, not the abstraction of history, but the physical, undeniable presence of a single human life, lived and lost, preserved by chance, in a way that few lives from that century ever are. Elsewhere in the wreck, the ordinary tools of Tudor daily life emerged, with a clarity that stunned historians who had, until then, relied largely on written inventories and second-hand description. A surgeon's chest was found nearly intact, its contents a catalogue of Tudor medical practice, ointment pots still holding trace residues of their original salves, a canister of what appeared to be a rudimentary antiseptic, delicate instruments for extracting arrowheads or setting bone. Tools that spoke of a medical profession balanced precariously between folk remedy and emerging science. The surgeon himself, whoever he had been, had not lived to use his chest again, but the chest survived to tell of his work in a way no letter or ledger ever could. Nearby, a cook's cauldron was recovered, blackened still by the fires that had heated it, alongside the bones of animals that had been part of meals prepared for a crew of hundreds. Cattle, pig, fish, evidence of a diet that, while monotonous by modern standards, was calculated to sustain heavy labor at sea. Wooden bowls and tankards, many still bearing the marks of the individual sailors who had owned them, carved initials or symbols into the wood to distinguish their own possessions from their neighbors, offered small human glimpses into shipboard life. A crew of men who, even amid the discipline of naval service, retained small personal habits, small claims of identity within the crowded communal space of the ship. Clothing recovered from the wreck told its own quiet story. Leather shoes, remarkably well preserved by the same anaerobic mud that had protected the bones, revealed the shapes of feet that had walked those decks daily, some patched and repaired multiple times, evidence of men who could not simply discard worn possessions, that had to make do, mend, and continue. Fragments of wool clothing, caps, and personal pouches suggested the texture of daily existence aboard, not the pageantry of a royal warship glimpsed from shore, but the practical, worn, lived-in reality of the men who served her, men whose lives depended on small comforts carefully maintained against the damp and the cold. Musical instruments were found as well, a small fiddle, a shawm, drums, evidence that music had accompanied life aboard, that even amid the discipline of naval routine, there had been moments of song, of rhythm, of small human pleasures. Gaming pieces, dice, and a set of what appeared to be a rudimentary board game suggested idle hours passed in play. The ordinary boredom of waiting between duties, finding its outlet in small competitions long since forgotten by name, but preserved nonetheless in the objects left behind. Each of these finds, individually modest, became collectively extraordinary, for together they offered something historians rarely receive from any single source: a complete cross-section of a specific moment in time, undisturbed by later additions or later loss, a sealed capsule of Tudor life preserved, not through careful curation, but through catastrophe. Other ships of the era had been broken up for salvage, burned, or simply allowed to rot once their service ended, their contents scattered or repurposed long before anyone thought to preserve them for study. The Mary Rose, in the terrible completeness of her sinking, had been spared that slow erosion. She had gone down whole in a single afternoon, carrying with her the entirety of a working ship's contents. And the mud had done what human intention rarely manages. It had kept everything indifferent to its value, preserving spoons and cannons with the same silent care. It is a strange gift, this kind of preservation, and one that historians and archaeologists have long approached with a certain uneasy reverence. The wealth of knowledge drawn from the Mary Rose exists only because of tragedy, because hundreds of men died suddenly, trapped beneath the netting meant to protect them, their belongings sinking with them into a silence that would last 3 centuries. There is something profoundly melancholy in recognizing that the very completeness which makes the wreck so valuable to scholars is inseparable from the completeness of the disaster itself. Had the ship survived that July afternoon, had she gone on to serve out her days, and eventually been broken up in the ordinary way of retired vessels, none of this would exist. No bows, no shoes, no surgeon's chest. It was only in dying all at once, in being sealed away rather than slowly dismantled, that she became this rare and complete record of an age. Today, all of it rests together in Portsmouth, in a museum built specifically to hold what the sea had kept and what human patience had recovered. The hull itself, dried and stabilized after decades of careful conservation, stands now within a controlled environment, viewable from angles that no sailor or shipwright of the 16th century could ever have imagined, lit softly to reveal the timbers that once carried men across the waters of the Solent. Around it, in careful display, rest the thousands of objects drawn from her: the bows and arrows, the surgeon's tools, the cook's cauldron, the shoes worn thin by feet long since turned to bone, the small wooden token bearing an initial carved by a hand that has been gone for 4 centuries. Visitors move quietly through these halls, as if some instinct tells them that this is not merely a museum of objects, but something closer to a memorial, a resting place, not just for a ship, but for the ordinary lives that once filled her decks. The Mary Rose then exists now in 2 forms at once: as a wreck, remembered for the disaster that took her down before a stricken king, and as an archive, treasured for the completeness of what she preserved. Both truths rest together in that quiet museum by the water, the tragedy and the treasure inseparable, the loss and the gift bound eternally to the same July afternoon when the sea closed over her and, in closing, kept safe what it might otherwise have scattered to time. In Portsmouth today, in a building shaped to hold both memory and matter, the hull of the Mary Rose rests beneath careful light, angled and dimmed to protect the wood that survived 4 centuries in darkness. Visitors move slowly through the space, as if the quiet of the sea has followed the ship ashore and settled over the room itself. The timbers are held now in a climate measured to the degree, humidity monitored as closely as a patient's breath, for wood that has spent so long in water is not the same as wood that has always known air. It must be coaxed back into the world gradually, and even now, decades after her raising, the process continues. A slow negotiation between the ship and the atmosphere she left behind on that July afternoon in 1545. She tilts, still, if only slightly, the same list that carried her under the waves preserved in the angle of her display, so that even in stillness she carries the memory of her going down. Visitors who lean close to the glass, who trace the line of her frames with their eyes, are looking not simply at an object, but at a moment. The moment when ambition and water met, and water did not yield. It is worth pausing in this final quiet to consider what the Mary Rose's story asks of those who hear it. She was built in pride, in the flush confidence of a new king eager to announce himself to Europe through timber and cannon, through the sheer physical fact of a warship larger and better armed than any that had come before. She served for 34 years with a competence that earned her little attention. The unglamorous virtue of reliability, rarely commemorated in song or story. And then, in the span of minutes, in calm water within sight of land, she went down. Not through the violence of battle, not through the fury of storm, but through some combination of factors so ordinary, so nearly avoidable, that the disaster reads less as tragedy in the grand tragic sense, and more as a lesson in how thin the margin runs between triumph and catastrophe. A few degrees of heel, a few feet of freeboard, a few gun ports left uncorrected in their closing. The difference between a ship that turns successfully and a ship that does not is sometimes no larger than an oversight. And the Mary Rose stands now as a permanent reminder that human endeavor, however grand, however well-funded, however carefully built, remains subject to margins so fine they can escape notice until the moment they close. And yet, for all that has been learned from her hull and her contents, the central question of her sinking remains only partially answered, argued over still by historians and naval architects who each bring their own weight of evidence to bear. Some point to the gun ports, insisting that water entering through those low openings, left open in the eagerness to fire a final broadside, must have been the decisive stroke that once the sea found its way in, the ship's fate was sealed within moments, the flooding uncontrollable, the additional weight dragging her down before any correction could take hold. Others look instead to the ballast and the modifications made across her decades of service, the added guns and thickened timbers that had shifted her center of gravity higher than her original designers intended, making her less forgiving of any heel, more vulnerable to a wind that a younger, lighter version of herself might have shrugged off without incident. Still others speak of the turn itself, of the particular combination of wind and command that brought her broadside against a gust at the precise moment her gun ports stood open and her crew stood crowded and unbalanced upon her decks, a convergence of ordinary decisions that happened on that afternoon to align into catastrophe. There is no single answer that satisfies every scholar, no smoking gun recovered from the mud that settles the matter beyond dispute. The Mary Rose sank from a combination of causes, human and structural and circumstantial, woven together so tightly that separating them cleanly may simply not be possible. And perhaps that, too, is part of what she teaches, that disasters rarely have single causes, that they arrive instead through the quiet accumulation of small conditions, each unremarkable alone, until they meet in a moment. It is worth returning in this final reckoning to the king who watched her go down. Henry VIII stood at Southsea Castle that afternoon with the confidence of a monarch anticipating a victory, his fleet arrayed before him, his flagship carrying his ambitions into the narrow waters of the Solent. He did not watch a battle unfold in the way he expected. He watched instead in the span of what witnesses described as mere minutes, one of his finest ships take water and vanish beneath the surface with almost all of her crew still aboard. A disaster so sudden that those on the surrounding vessels could do little more than watch the masts disappear and pull the handful of survivors from water still. churning with the ship's descent. It is a strange kind of witness to see one's own ambition sink before one's eyes, transformed in an instant from a source of pride into a source of grief so acute that, by the accounts of those who attended him, the king cried out. Whatever else Henry VIII was, and history has recorded him as many things, vain and formidable and mercurial in turn. In that moment, he was simply a man watching something he had built, something that carried his name and his hopes for a fleet capable of matching the great powers of the continent, disappear into water that gave no sign afterward of what it had taken. The crown does not exempt a person from grief, and the records suggest that Henry's grief that day was genuine, immediate, and lasting enough to be remembered by those who stood near him. There is something in this image: the king on the shore, the ship beneath the waves, the distance between ambition and outcome, collapsed into a single afternoon that reaches beyond the particular history of Tudor England into something more universal. Every age builds its own vessels of ambition, its own structures meant to carry hope and to demonstrate power and to outlast the ordinary limits of a single lifetime. And every age discovers, sooner or later, that the margin between what is intended and what actually occurs remains narrower than pride would prefer to believe. The sea, in this sense, functions as more than a setting for the Mary Rose's story. It functions as a metaphor for the larger indifference that meets all human effort, an indifference that does not distinguish between the careful and the careless, between the well-funded and the improvised, between kings and common sailors. Water does not consult intention. It simply moves according to its own patient logic, and when a structure fails to account for that logic, when a gun port is left open, when a design has drifted too far from its original balance, when a wind arrives at the precise wrong moment, the sea accepts what is given to it without ceremony, without malice, and often without much notice at all, beyond the local disturbance of the moment. And it kept what it took. This is perhaps the quieter, more contemplative truth that emerges from the whole of the Mary Rose's long history. That the sea's patience is not only destructive, but preservative. That the same water which closed over the ship in July of 1545 also sealed her below the mud of the Solent for nearly 4.5 centuries, holding her timbers and their contents in a stillness so complete that when divers finally reached her in the 20th century, they found not ruin, but suspension, an entire world held in a kind of extended pause. The sea took the ship and gave nothing back for generations, and then, through circumstances no one could have planned, it yielded her up again, imperfectly, incompletely, but astonishingly intact, given the centuries involved. There is a kind of grace in this, though it is a grace indifferent to human intention. A grace that simply follows the physical properties of mud and oxygen and tide, rather than any design toward memory or meaning. And yet the effect, whatever its cause, has been to grant later generations something rare, a direct physical encounter with a moment, from deep in the past, unmediated by artistic reconstruction or literary embellishment, a ship and its contents that speak for themselves. If you were to stand today at the water's edge near Portsmouth and look out across the Solent, you would see very little to suggest what lies within its history. The water moves in its ordinary rhythm, grey and green by turns, depending on the sky, ferries and pleasure boats crossing paths where warships once maneuvered under sail and oar. Nothing about the surface hints at what rests below or what once transpired above it. This is perhaps the final and most enduring quality of the sea, its capacity to hold enormous events within an unremarkable present, to carry the weight of centuries without disturbing the calm of an afternoon. The Mary Rose sank in these waters, and the waters closed, and life continued along the shore much as it always had, ships coming and going, tides rising and falling until the accumulated weight of years made the disaster into something closer to legend than memory. It took deliberate searching, patient work across decades, and no small amount of fortune to bring her back into the light. And even now, having done so, the sea keeps its patience about the rest, the artifacts not yet found, the questions not yet answered. The countless other vessels and lives it holds within its depths, without any promise of ever giving them up. If this quiet history has settled something in you tonight, a sense of time's patience, or the fragile margins on which human ambition rests, you are welcome to seek out more lost voyages on this channel, more ships, and their fates gathered slowly, the same way the sea gathers what it keeps. There is no need to hurry toward them. They will wait, as the Mary Rose waited, for whenever you are ready to listen.